So class, this is our very first lecture. We want to look at the topic of an introduction to supply chain management. Now, supply chain management, and over the last, I would say, decade and a half, has really gained strategic prominence, and largely because as companies continue to search for competitive advantage, they are looking at all aspects of their operations. We're not really talking about product design, we're talking about facility location, inventory management, and so on. It turns out that the supply chain is responsible for a fair amount of value added to customers, but also a fair amount of value added to the bottom line. Largely because supply chain costs tend to be fairly significant, and in some cases could be up to about 80% of the cost of goods sold. Now just think about, for example, raw fish. If you're selling fresh fish, and so what are the main costs that go into that? All the costs that tend to go into that are supply chain costs. You have fishing trawlers that actually need to go out there, catch the fish, and then bring it to a port. And then from there, you have some logistics and transportation might take it from that port to a facility that would actually retail the fish fresh. And so there's no extra value added to a large extent because you're selling the product as fresh fish. And so the bulk of the cost of that good that is sold is really supply chain costs. All right, so what is supply chain management? If you think of a supply chain, whether or not you think of, say, a can of pop that's in your hand, your cell phone, or the clothes that you're wearing, there's a whole bunch of activities that go on before this product actually gets to you. So we're looking at here that supply chain management involves the flow of materials, products, services. All right, and so in the case of products and services, we could think of raw materials manufacturers. So if you want to make, say, aluminum foil, you have raw materials such as bauxite that needs to be excavated and processed. So that's raw materials before you could actually get to the stage of making aluminum foil. In some cases, we actually make what we call intermediate products, which are components. So for example, if you're producing bicycles, you will have at some stage in the supply chain, somebody's producing the sprockets, or somebody's actually producing the seats, or somebody's producing the handlebars. And so those are sort of intermediate products. And then of course you have the manufacturers who actually produce the complete end product. So that would be the bicycle manufacturer or the automobile manufacturer. And then you have wholesalers and distributors. So some people who will be the wholesalers would receive shipments from a manufacturer, and then they either ship to distributors or ship to retailers. Distributors, in this case, tend to be these sort of warehouses that would house the product, and they ship from the distributor to the retailer. And then of course you have retailers in that chain. So the chain could be quite complex with very many players, and at each stage as you go back into the chain, you could have multiple players, and so supply chain could actually be quite complex, and so the management of those chains would also be complex as well. Typically those various components of the supply chain tend to be connected by transportation and storage activities. Also, there is an integration of those various parts through information. So if you purchase a good at Walmart and the point of sales data gets communicated to the warehouse, which then gets communicated to the factory. So the information flows backwards, cash flows backwards, but goods flow forward. So we also tend to think of a supply chain as really a flow of all of these various aspects. All right. There are a couple of definitions. You'll find some minor variations in them, but for the most part, they pretty much say the same thing. So here's one definition our text gives us, which is the supply chain management is a set of approaches utilized to efficiently integrate suppliers, manufacturers, wholesalers, warehouses, and stores, so that merchandise is produced and distributed at the right quantities to the right locations at the right time in order to minimize sort of system-wide costs, because at each stage of that supply chain you do have different costs, and you want to minimize the overall cost of getting the product, because the cost is additive, the overall cost of getting the product to the customer. At the same time, you want to meet service level requirements. There's no good giving a customer a good at the cheapest possible price, but if it arrives way too late. All right, so we have to kind of balance those two things if we want to be able to um, do this. So we have a couple of other formal definitions, and one is that is the design and management of seamless value-added processes across organizational boundaries to meet real needs of the end customer. So kind of very, if you wish, nebulous kind of a definition. It doesn't really give you much detail like the last one, the design and management of seamless value-added processes. So what are those processes? And across organizational boundaries mean that you have different players in the supply chain. Managing the Institute of Supply Chain Management offers this one: managing supply and demand, sourcing raw materials and parts, manufacturing and assembly, warehousing and inventory tracking, order entry and order management, distribution across all channels, and the delivery to the customer. So again, fairly heavily manufacturing focus, you could kind of sense in this particular definition. All right. Let's just take a look at an example of a supply chain. And you'll see in the personal computer industry, if we work backwards, you kind of get a better sense of how the supply chain sort of proliferates as you go way back to the raw materials manufacturers. So here you have your final customers. You could have some individuals, you could have some large enterprises, some consumers, small, medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. And they could receive the products from resellers, retail, integrators, dealers, and so on. Or you have local assemblers, people who would actually take the components and actually just assemble them just before it gets to the customer. Then you go back one stage before the resellers can receive the product. You have distributors who would supply them based on whatever orders that they actually place to the distribution centers or the warehouses. In some cases, you would have here, for example, global logistics companies. If you notice, it's a direct line to final customers. So that would be like the sort of Dell model, where a computer is actually manufactured and then shipped directly to a customer via some third-party logistics provider. And so that would be the Dell model, for example. So you have Dell Gateway, they manufacture the personal computers and ship via these folks right here. Then if you go back one step, well, before you get to the Dell and the gateways and so on and IBMs, then you have contract manufacturers. So these guys, so for example, Dell might give somebody to manufacture its chassis for it, the motherboard and so on, the hard drives. Either contract manufacturers or might actually purchase those components themselves. So you can see component distributors that actually provide those to the contract manufacturers here as well, or provide components to assemblers who would then create the final product. And then before that, you have now all the sort of raw material providers, so component makers. Then you have storage, semiconductors, motherboards, flat panel displays, etc. So as you can see with just this example of a personal computer, we have multiple stages in the supply chain. And so try to imagine, how do you manage that chain if you're the reseller, or if you're a Dell, or if you're an IBM? What parts of this can you control? How do you influence the various stages of that supply chain so that you could get the kind of service levels that you want, or the cost efficiencies that you're seeking? All right. So if we just look at the bottom here and we go back, we see we go from sales, service and support to distribution, Prior to distribution, we have assembly. Prior to assembly, we have manufacturing. And then, of course, you have research and development activities as well. All right. So all of those are different aspects of the supply chain. Here's another example with Cisco. As many of you know, that Cisco is a fairly large company that makes multiple products and so forth. So if we start from step one, you have orders are configured through their website, so they're using information technology to gather demand data, and of course that information is then transmitted throughout the organization. So step two, orders are automatically transmitted to suppliers, scheduled in Cisco's production system. So Cisco may have a system where it actually produces the order itself, or it has a contract manufacturer that's actually producing for it. That's number two. Number three here, you see the contract manufacturers or Cisco's production system. So you go from 2 to 4 or 2 to 3, and builds and ships 60% of units direct to customers. So it would actually, Cisco would manage that supply chain, receive the order, ship that order to a contract manufacturer, and rather than receiving the manufactured product and storing that in a warehouse before it's actually shipped to customers, Cisco would just have its contract manufacturer ship directly to its customers, its final customers. And then you have Cisco's production, so they configure only highly complex orders. So you realize what they've done is they use contract manufacturers for perhaps more standard products, and their own production facilities for more complex products. And then you have consolidation centers where that receive the product before they get out to consumers. So that's just another example of a network. If you want to look at flows in a supply chain management system, we'll see that we have material flow, flowing from the raw material sources towards consumers. And then we have value-added services. So as we go up the chain, the forward chain that is, we add value at each stage, and that's why the product gets more and more expensive. However, flowing backwards, we have demand information. So when a customer actually places an order, that information gets transmitted backwards. When a customer pays the retailer, retailer has to pay a distributor, distributor has to pay say a wholesaler has to pay a manufacturer, manufacturer has to pay raw material supplier. So you have the sort of backward flow of funds. And then of course information can flow in both directions, where the sort of sales data can flow backwards, but also you have production data can flow forward as well. And then we have here reuse, maintenance, after sales service flow. So this is an example where we could have a different service, after sales service data flowing in multiple directions. All right. And here's just another example of a supply chain network where you have customers, warehouses and distribution centers, manufacturers, and raw material suppliers. And we could find that in many, many examples. Now, in managing the supply chain, we have to pay attention to all the various components that impact costs, that impact service. And so, in some cases, you need to consider your suppliers, or your customers' customers. So if you're thinking about, for example, you supply a garage, an auto service center, we're facilitating goods, oil, lubricants, etc. Well, you have to think about what their customers might actually be looking for, the kind of value that they expected to get, and that impacts your supply chain, because the demand for service from say consumers will impact the demand for the facilitating goods from the distribution centers. So your customers are also important. All right. Now, in terms of sort of performance issues, there is the need to ensure that the supply chain is actually efficient and cost effective. And so to get that, one cannot just simply focus on small parts of the supply chain. You have to look at the entire chain as a system. And so there's a need for what we call a systems level approach to looking at the supply chain. So you got to look at it from all the way back from the raw material supplier down to the final consumer. There are different levels of activities in a supply chain. We could actually separate that out when you think about production or supply chain management, or just how organizations function. We often tend to think of these three operating levels: strategic, tactical, and operational. And the strategic level tends to deal with decisions such as, where should we locate our facility? Um, how many distribution centers should we have? What should our product design actually look like? Those sorts of decisions that have sort of long-term impacts, long-term implications. We got to give that consideration. Tactical decisions typically are made within, say, excuse me, 6 months to a year or quarter to a year. And those sort of decisions might look at issues such as, well, who do we order from over the next quarter? How do we allocate the orders to the various suppliers and what quantities and so forth? And at the operational level, you do much more sort of day-to-day scheduling, such as what will we receive this week, next week, tomorrow, and then how do we schedule the logistics, and how do we handle the payments, and how do we try, deal with some of the information that we've gathered and analyze that and so forth. So each stage has implications for the efficiency or the performance of the supply chain management, also the supply chain itself. All right. So if you've located facilities in the wrong place, and the market dynamics change, that could be catastrophic. If at a tactical level you're not planning over the medium term well enough, your forecasts are off significantly. Allocation of production to your different facilities and so on. How much should your contract manufacturers produce versus your own facility produce? If you don't handle that well, your supply chain costs can also be very high. And of course, if you do very poor scheduling of receipt of goods or supply of goods to customers, then that could also be an issue. One of the things that we must be mindful of is that we cannot do supply chain management in isolation because there's so many parts to it, and we do not necessarily control every single part. When I say we, if you're looking at it from the perspective of, say, wherever you stand in the supply chain, if you're the manufacturer, if you're the distributor, wholesaler, etc., retailer, you may not necessarily have control over all parts of the chain unless you are fully vertically integrated. So in a case like that, you have to understand that you have to begin to collaborate. So supply chain strategy cannot be determined in isolation. Supply chain strategy is linked to what we call a development chain, so the different parts. The development chain really has to do with the actual product development itself, the design of that product, the manufacturing of that product. But once that product is actually manufactured, it then needs to go through the supply chain. Now, at the manufacturing stage, you have part of the supply chain that will bring the raw materials to the facility to be manufactured. And then, of course, the balance of that supply chain will take the manufactured product to the consumer, right? That is typically to a warehouse or distribution center, and from the distribution center to the retailers then to the consumer. Right? Now, there are many players, as we mentioned, and so in minimizing costs, you have to really work with the various parties who have interests in the supply chain. And then, of course, there is this issue called uncertainty and risk. And uncertainty and risk has major implications for your cost efficiencies and your service levels. So we have to know information about the demands. We have to have information about the lead times, but both of those can be uncertain in many, many situations. All right. So I will pause at this point and then continue with the second part of our introduction to supply chain management.